Alessia. How are you?
Very well. How are you?
Yeah, it's good to see you. It's been a couple of years, right?
Exactly. That was in 2019 that we had our first conversation.
Yeah. So I suppose you've been very busy over the last couple of years, right?
Well, yeah, let's say that I've tried to keep myself quite busy with creativity and the conference and a lot of changes in my life. So yeah, I think
Well, a lot of changes in everyone's life over the last 18 months through the pandemic. We've all had to
or
adapt.
some were volunteer, some were intentional, but yeah.
And I suppose that in hindsight, all of this will be a story, it'll be another story added to, all the different stories that we had up to now. This is another story. And I know that in your coaching work, you probably, I know that a lot of coaches, they use storytelling to create change. Is that something that you work on as well, Alessia?
Well, I think yes, this is something I do too, and I think storytelling is really important for us as coaches, as facilitators, for everybody who's working with other people, especially to stimulate their creativity and new ways of thinking and expressing their words, to find new meaning in their lives and what they want to develop. Absolutely.
Yeah. And storytelling is a skill, and not everyone has the skill to tell stories, although we create our own stories. But there is a difference between storytelling and our own lived experience and creating our own stories, isn't there? There is and I suppose there's more kind of empowerment when we learn to create our own stories more consciously.
Yeah, absolutely. Not everybody knows storytelling as a skill. Some people are amazing storytellers, some people are just spontaneous storytellers, and some people are not so very good storytellers at all. But is that really important? I'm wondering, because it's not the aim is not the performance. It's not the how you tell a story and how you can engage. In my work and what I perceive about storytelling is really a means for people to express themselves. So it doesn't matter if they tell the story in a beautiful way or in an exciting, engaging way. It's the power of that story that is emerging that is really a powerful tool for creativity to emerge. And recently, I read the work of David Eagleman, a neuroscientist who studies neuroplasticity. And the title of his book, the one that I read and really impressed me, is The Brain, the Story of You. And in this book, he describes how memory and dream are so interconnected. So as you were saying, when we spontaneously tell a story, it's like we are giving voice to a dream, to imagination. And in doing that, do we sometimes start from previous events or previous things that happened to us, previous stories that we somehow manage to completely change and reshape to give life to something new? And it's the power of the human mind and the human brain to see stories everywhere.
That's right. And there's the link between, not everyone makes that link between dreams and our conscious stories, because the stories that we dream about, it's as though they're part of our unconscious, and the interrelationships between what is the unconscious and what is it that we envisage in our current reality. How do they interlink with each other? And I suppose the work of neuroscientists, they have a lot to teach us in this respect. And the thing about stories, like when you use stories for coaching, it's that every story can be interpreted according to the relevance to the person who is listening to that story. doesn't just have one interpretation. It's like there's multiple interpretations, and the key thing is that the values in the stories, and even though you may intend to incorporate certain values, but the values that the audience picks up may be totally different to what you intended.
Absolutely, and that's another amazing power of stories that postmodernism has really taught us. So, do we have one interpretation? Do we have multiple interpretations? Do we have unlimited interpretations? Because this unlimited is the number of people that are listening to our stories. Yes, that's right, and it's amazing how when you tell a story, maybe for the fourth or fifth or millionth time, that story sounds new to you too. So maybe in the act of telling that story, also for you, it takes a different shape and a different interpretation. This is something that David Eagleman is also studying. So when we tell about an event previously in our life, and we rethink about it a few years later, it takes a completely different meaning and for us.
It's as you talk about that, it reminds me of the importance of context in terms of when is that story told? So, for example, Rudyard Kipling, the author of The Jungle Book, for example, when he wrote that book, the Jungle Book stories were interpreted by British people, by English people, in a very different way to the way those books are interpreted by those that he was writing about. And in context, so 100 years ago, those stories may not have seemed as racist as they seem now, with the interplay of like the different cultures. It was, and a lot of people say, well, you should interpret the story based on the time that it was written in, like Charles Dickens and whatever, but no, we can't go back in time. We have to interpret stories based on who we are, where we are, and how we are right now in the present, right?
Yeah, that's a really big open question that you're asking. I would say yes, and why not the other way too? So it's a two-way of interpreting stories. So the story, like a story from the past, like the Jungle Book, still tells us something new to us as readers today. And that's the power of great books that really made history. They are always new. They always have something to say to all generations. We're still reading and we're still using the ancient myths. So imagine that. I mean, they are renewing themselves every day. Every day, a myth can be relived in somebody's life. So that's one aspect. The other aspect, obviously, is putting those myths in context, because obviously we're not worshipping Athena as a goddess or Artemis as a goddess anymore. So we need to understand who they were in their specific and particular culture. And as you were saying about the Jungle Book, so it's always a two thing, understanding where a story was written and how and for whom, and what is the story telling us today.
Yeah, and so many, I know that Disney World, for example, they've started to reinterpret fairy stories. There was a film that I saw, it's famous, isn't it? But the princess and the fairy godmothers, one of them is not invited, and she becomes very upset and curses the princess. And in this is it Rapunzel?
Rapunzel. Well, go on. We'll come. Yeah.
Beauty. I'm not sure which of those. It might be either Sleeping Beauty or Rapunzel, but in this reinterpretation, we find that fairy godmother who was upset, like she was portrayed as a witch basically in the original fairy story, but in this reinterpretation, you find that the king had actually clipped her wings. So yeah, so the reason she was so upset is because her wings had been clipped, and that's kind of quite a feminist kind of reinterpretation, I suppose, you know, of like the suffering that women have to go through, and how their suffering is portrayed as neuroticism as opposed to oppression, and their desire for emancipation. So fairy stories that have influenced our behavior, like, you know, children, little girls may have aspired to grow up and to become princesses waiting to be rescued, and now instead they're waiting to grow up and to seek freedom rather than to be rescued.
Yeah, that's a very powerful that's a very powerful interpretation of stories, and a really powerful way of teaching little girls new things. Yeah, it might be. It's interesting. It really is interesting how many reinterpretation we can offer to the girls today. So we can offer the story as is with no interpretation, and giving it to the little girl to see what they say in that, and then having a discussion, and also suggesting a reinterpretation of the same story, and then asking the little girl what she makes of what she's just seeing. So it's a never-ending tool that you really can use with you know, to spread culture, to stimulate new thinking. I always believe that even if we come up with a new interpretation, is always the viewer who needs really to chip in and give their own contribution. What does that story is telling them? What is that particular specific moment that is really opening the door for new connections for them?
You know, in the past, people used to tell stories. So mothers, grandmothers, aunts would tell stories about perhaps their lived experiences, and men would tell stories about their lived experiences, and embellish those stories with stories that were passed on. But when we started to rely more on the written stories as opposed to stories that are told, then, you know, as I'm sure we'll both agree, that it tended to be men that wrote the stories. You know, in terms of like writers, they were men rather than women. Women were remained oral storytellers, but then as our culture became more and more influenced by the written word and our reliance on written stories, there became perhaps like more of an inequality of like how stories influence people. What do you think about that?
Okay, yeah, that's a very good reflection that you are offering, and how can I disagree on that? It's mainly men who wrote stories. What's really important, and it's a subject that I'm really thinking about these days, is how powerful women's circles are in the fact that they are really keeping the tradition of communicating and sharing among them. So yeah, for sure, there are the big stories that are probably written by men, and women have this very strong power of being able to speak and communicate and be with one another, something that men really can't do, especially these days. And I think this is such a strong, powerful moment for education and for really expressing the personalities that women have, in contrast with the main male culture, if you like.
I suppose a lot of the women getting together and forming circles, a lot of it, you know, it's like, well, are those stories helpful that they're sharing? And obviously we believe that they are, because otherwise we wouldn't partake of, you know, like being part of those circles. But they can, like, especially like when it's more informal, women have the reputation for being gossipers. And I see gossip is very often put, you know, the connotations of gossiping are usually negative, but I think that gossiping is the glue that keeps people together, because, you know, through that gossiping, through that passing on information one from the other, those relationships become strengthened in some way. But when everyone's just totally minding their own business, no one's talking about anybody else, I find that sometimes those relationships can weaken.
Yeah, you say gossip. Yeah, certainly for some women, gossip is is a main vehicle of a conversation and of bonding. Yeah, I agree with that, especially in corporate environments, in offices. Oh my gosh, this is really a big thing. What's behind gossip? Behind gossip, I think, is the need for women to make meaning, to reinterpret, to understand what's going on. It's probably the emotional intelligence of women that really needs to speak and elaborate through sharing with others, to understanding other women's point of view, and to digging into emotions and feelings, and not only on rational thoughts and cognitive aspects of relationships. So sometimes that takes a shape of gossiping, which can be very, very toxic. And sometimes, if that need is expressed in a positive and constructive way, that becomes really a strong tool also for coaching, and where we can use storytelling, understanding and digging deeper into some of the characters, why they did that, why they did not do that, how did they make that choice, what was pushing them to go to that direction rather than the other, and connecting with a character in a story as if they were our colleagues or our friends, and that we were talking about, is a very powerful way of make the stories ours, and reliving the stories and the power of myth that is in each story.
In some cases, like that, gossiping can have such an impact on our behavior that it's a form of control, isn't it? Because there are certain things that in a traditional kind of society, in a traditional community, in a very strong, cohesive community, there are things that we may not do simply because we don't want people gossiping and saying, oh, you know, she bought pink shoes, you know, she's wearing X, Y, and Z, and you know, you don't want people gossiping about you, so therefore you don't want them constructing a story about you, saying that your behavior is good, or well, saying in the negative form that your behavior is bad in some way, shape, or form. So these stories can have an impact on our behavior. They're like moral compasses, aren't they? Like, this is what is good, you know, based on what the society thinks, the judgments. And I think in coaching we are encouraged not to make judgments, but stories kind of almost force us to make a judgment. In a story, we know what is good, we know what is bad, so we do make judgments, don't we?
Yeah, what you're saying is very powerful, very true. Like, sometimes we find ourselves in environments where the gossip culture is so strong, we don't feel free to express who we really are, and we adopt behaviors that are not dictated by our own personality and way and desire to express ourselves, but just because the environment demands certain behaviors, then we adopt them. And so in a creative culture, in a coaching culture, we try to build a climate of trust, and where we suspend judgment and we don't judge on each other, in a way that everyone can really express what's moving them. So it's a step-by-step process, obviously, for groups, and also in a one-on-one coaching relationships. And you're saying stories sometimes tell us what is good and what is not good. Yes, sometimes they do, and sometimes it's really the moral of stories is really strong and really clear. And it's very important, for me, what is very important is to take that moral, take that meaning from a story that you're reading and you're reliving, and what does it tell to you? Discuss it. Find the areas where you agree with that. Find the areas where you have doubts, you have questions about, and try and question it more and more, so you can really dig deeper and find something new. Let something new emerge in this discussion, and that's the power of creativity.
And I suppose our own stories, like, of course, as we reflect on our stories, we can change them, adapt them, but our stories are interrelated with the stories of everyone else around us. So if we change our own story, it will have an impact on other people's stories. And so that's where, in coaching work, when we're coaching an individual, we can't think of that individual in isolation, because that person's story is wrapped up in everyone else's stories.
That's right. It's thinking. This is thinking in a systemic way, thinking as a system. So we are not individual planets, but we belong to a solar system. So let's play with that. Beautiful. This is so powerful for as a coaching tool. So when you realize what your storytelling is, and maybe your recurrent patterns, and when you realize that you keep putting something in place, and that leads to that same reaction every time in each aspect of your life, that maybe is the time where you really need to say, okay, stop. What if I changed that behavior? What would happen to the whole system? And maybe you start changing a behavior step by step, reinterpreting your own personal story, your own personal storytelling, and you suddenly see that things are reacting in a different way. And that really is a way to bring change, both to your own behavior in your own life, but also to the lives of others in the relationship with you. So that's the way we are constantly interconnected, and a small change of behavior can really create a ripple effect that affects the whole system in such a positive way.
Absolutely. Yeah. So in terms of like the mysteries of creativity in stories, I mean, I suppose every story, there are mysterious depths to the story that, we talked earlier about the unconscious, and there's so much in those stories that, the way we interpret a story now in 10 years' time will be totally different, because there were things that we didn't notice. Even in a simple story, there's always layers of things that we don't have the capacity to understand. Like even poetry, for example. Poetry, you can have a simple poem, a 3-line poem, for example, and it can have so much, like the meanings can be so profound, and we're not always ready to be aware of those meanings.
Yeah, that's the magic. That's the magic of art, isn't it? The magic of a poem. Where, how do you read a poem? Do you try to interpret it, or you just read it and absorb it and maybe memorize it? And what happens when you incubate that poem, when those words resonate into your mind, into your body? What happens to you? If you memorize a poem, you go out in the world, you live your day, you live your life, and maybe some of those words will suddenly pop out at some point of your day, and they will lead to new connections, and they will lead to maybe aha moments where you make meaning of something that you weren't thinking could really have a meaning for you, that was completely obscure just a few moments before, and it's completely clear, and it's aha moment for you, a direction, an insight that can lead to many other different experiences. So can I bring an example that is really powerful to me? So I'm on a 50-day challenge, and every day I make something, and what I decided to make is to draw a tree. I'm not an artist. I'm not good at drawing, so forget forget all that. I decided to suspend judgment on myself and just go with pen and paper and see what happens. So every day, at the end of my day, I take my pen, take my sketchbook, and I draw a tree. It's not pretty, but it tells something about my day. It's a connection that I'm making, a new something, and I sort of draw my day in the shape of a tree. I give it meaning, then I show it to other people. They interpret it in a completely different way, which is so far away from mine. And I know this is a principle really of artistry. Like, artists are really not that good at describing their own works. They only give it to the world, and it's up to the others to interpret it. If you try and do this practice of giving something to the world, something that doesn't have to be pretty or perfect or artistic or anything, but just give it and see what happens in other people. That's a very powerful tool. In engaging in this conversation, what was my intention? What do you see in it? And then something new can happen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's about creating, you've provided a stimulus through your trees, or whatever expression, that's the stimulus, and it's the response can be there are millions of different possibilities of like what the response to that is going to be if you allow the space. And I suppose this kind of goes back to learning. It's like there's not always going to be a correct answer, there's not going to be a correct interpretation, and whereas some people would argue, yes, there is. It's like you have to, I suppose most of our education systems are built on that structure of like, we have to teach them how to find the right answer. And
we are trying to give a different way, a new way of approaching stories, approaching arts, approaching poetry, or anything, and it's the way of communication. So let's take a story, let's take a poem, a tree, a drawing, as a stimulus to engage in a powerful conversation. And then from that powerful conversation, something new can happen. It's not a matter of right or wrong or learn it, to memorize it. It's just a matter of what happens when a person encounters a story, what the relationship is between that person, that story, and the third party that might be a teacher, might be a coach, might be a facilitator that is really trying to facilitate that conversation between the person and the story that they are in front of.
And I suppose it's about broadening someone's awareness that there are many other interpretations apart from their own. They might have a particular interpretation, which is all well and good, but they have to realize that, if they're in a group of 20 people, there will be 20 different interpretations of because everyone has different values, different positions, different life experiences, different beliefs. So their interpretations will be based on this kind of complex set of variables that have enabled them to arrive at that particular interpretation.
Yeah, and now you're making me think of the power of diverging. So in a group of 10 people, you might find 20 interpretations. What if you encourage these 20 people to at least come up with 3 interpretations each, or 5 interpretations? How many interpretations can we have in a big group? And that really could happen in different and new worlds to everybody else, to exploring. And when you think you can only see one thing, one interpretation into something, try and find a different perspective, try and find a different point of view. And this is a way of developing your brain and really trying growing as a human being.
Yes, and also always being aware of the unknown. So even though like 20 people could have 20 different interpretations and we become aware of these interpretations, there is always like, well, who was not there to put forward their interpretation? What about those that are absent? How would they interpret? So there's always that unknown, isn't there? It's like we only see what as far as we can see, but what is like beyond our peripheral vision? You know, what is it that we're not being aware of? And that's where the mystery is. The mystery is that unknown, that and unless we ask ourselves powerful questions about the mystery, the magic, and the unknown, we're going to be avoiding like that fuller tapestry that we're a part of, because we're part of a bigger story, aren't we?
That's right. We're all part of such a big story. We don't have an idea of what we are part of. We try sometimes to abstract with our mind and go bigger and bigger and bigger, and we really can't see the limit to that.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's, I suppose that story is not just, you know, on this planet. That story that we're a part of involves the whole galaxy and, you know, other universes, and so that is the unknown. We don't know how we fit in with the story seen from different perspectives that are, you know, just totally beyond our awareness and our knowledge at this point in time.
It's a fabulous journey, isn't it?
Mm.
And the power of creativity is it's a vehicle to try and navigate into that unknown and imagine what's beyond, and try and use our imagination to see what we can't see, explore what we can explore. And as we develop it, you know, further and further and further, what are the surprises that you might bring? It's a really great mystery, the mystery of the big and the mystery of the small. That's great mystery in the small.
Yeah. Excellent. Brilliant. Well, thank you very much, Alessia. I've loved my conversation with you, and we'll speak again very soon, I hope.
Sure, and best of luck with your fabulous work.
Okay, thank you. Likewise. Bye for now.